This is the Horse Radio Network.
This is episode 16 of Equestrian Legends. Hello, I'm Chris Stafford, and my guest this week is Betty Ann Lester. Betty Ann Gilbert Lester was born in Village Green, Delaware County, Pennsylvania, on July 5, 1933, to Clarence Mitchell Gilbert and Lila Wilson Gilbert. The second of 4 children and the only daughter, Betty Ann did not have horsey parents, but learned her early riding skills from her father's uncle, Peter Marshall. Growing up against the background of World War II, she soon took to the hunting field with the Rose Tree Hunt Club and Radnor Hunt, and then enjoyed competing in both hunters and jumpers. With the early influences of Bill Steinkraus and Bert Dinemothy, she found success in the international arena before switching to 3-day eventing by way of hunter trials. For the past 40 years, Betty Ann has concentrated on dressage and credits Germany's Fritz Stecken and Paul Keck for instilling in her the principles of classical dressage. Betty Ann continues to school dressage horses and also enjoys teaching the next generations. Betty Ann married Donald Lester in 1955 and had 4 children, Patricia, Marianne, Donald, now deceased, and Wayne, as well as 4 grandchildren. She lives in Unionville, Pennsylvania. Well, Betty, you spent a lot of your early days with some great horsemen and women, and one of our earlier guests here on the show was a friend of yours, Bill Steinkraus, and I know you've got an interesting story to tell about him.
Oh, yes. Well, this is sort of, he may laugh when he hears this, because it was years ago when I was sitting in his office with Fritz Stecken, and I was discussing with him at the time, and I was in my early time with the dressage, that Steinbrecht's book, The Gymnasium of the Horse, which was only in German, should be printed in the United States. Now, at that time, Bill Steinkraus was the editor for Arco Publishing House. And I said, this book has been one of the most valuable books that I had ever read on the training, classical training of horses. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Betty," he said, no. He said, we can't print that in the United States. And I said, why? He said, there are no pictures in it. Now, this is the interesting upshot. If you pick up the Gymnasium of the Horse today, that has been translated into English, you will see the foreword by William Steinkraus. And he says in his foreword that this is one of the most fantastic books and invaluable in the library of every horseman. So I just got a kick out of that, because it took him, 35 years to get it printed.
Well, some wonderful...
He's a great guy. You know, he's done so much for our horse world. Bill Steinkraus has never been given, I think, the credit that he should have for what he has done to help the equestrian art in the United States.
Well, you have some wonderful memories of those great horsemen and women, not least the ones that have influenced you and your career. And I want to talk a lot more about that in a minute, Betty Ann. But first of all, let's start in those early days. You've been in Pennsylvania all your life, haven't you?
Oh, yes, I have. Mm-hmm.
And you grew up in Delaware County. That was where you were born. So tell us about your very early childhood and your very earliest memories. What kind of background did you grow up against?
Well, my parents actually were not horse people. They were more interested. My father was a school teacher, and they were very much more interested in seeing me in the field of music. I studied music for quite a few years, but it was always in my heart second to the horses, and I play the organ and piano, and that's been a big part of my life. But it's been very important for me in my horse world, because I found that my training of the horses had to go hand in glove with music.
The two both require the rhythm to make them work, don't they?
Well, rhythm, because a horse is pure rhythm. The walk is pure 4-beat, the trot is pure 2-beat, and the canter 3-beat. And the tempo must remain the same. So, that's what it is. And that's why classical music is always so beneficial to the training of horses.
And this, of course, is something you share with Bill Steinkraus, himself being a musician.
Good. Well, he was trained by a very, very famous horseman that I was also connected with sort of in a parallel way, and that was Berthold Dynamity. And, of course, Berthold Dynamity was trained by Fritz Stecken, who was my mentor and lived in our home for about 8 years and taught me. And we never rode, all of our training was always done with the music.
Now, you said your parents were not particularly horsey, but your father's uncle Peter Marshall, he was an influence in your very early days.
Oh, he was very much. He's the one that really started me fox hunting and put me on my first pony when I was little. And when I was 10 years old, I started fox hunting alongside of him.
So what was your parents' reaction then, since they wanted you to focus on...
No, they were not happy. They were never happy with that. They fussed about that all the time, but it didn't get them very far.
Now, you were one of 4 children. You have
Yes, I was.
3 brothers. Now, they didn't follow your interest then into the horse world.
Oh, not at all. My older brother, who's 18 months older than I, went into medicine, and he is a cardiologist, and in fact was one of the first cardiologists to develop the pacemaker. So he was a doctor, and then I had 2 younger brothers. That one is school teacher, and then he went into real estate later.
So when you were growing up in Pennsylvania, there, Betty Ann, at that time. In history, what was your early influences? Were you interested in school, or were you one of those horse-mad children that just couldn't wait to get home and play with horses? What were your earliest influences and memories?
Well, I think it was a mixture of both. My father and my mother were very influential, and I also had a dying desire to learn. Education, and I didn't think of it as education, but I always was inquisitive. So school was important, and important that I felt that I really, and of course, you see, I'm 78 now, and when I grew up, it was at a time when women were not encouraged to go on for higher education. But thank goodness for one of the good things that the Second World War did for us, if you can call it anything, is that it did influence more direction for education for women.
What do you remember of the World War II and the atmosphere that you were growing in up against that?
Oh, what do I remember of World War II?
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Well, I remember Pearl Harbor, and that's, I think that anyone my age would remember that day and the reaction, the horrified reaction that we all had, and, of course, the war years. And it was sort of interesting because later you see Fritz Stecken, who was a German at the time and in Germany, and we were not too happy with the Germans, but I learned to admire the Germans very greatly after that. But growing up, we lost people both in the Asian front and with the Japanese and with the Germans. So it was an unpleasant time for us.
Of course. What was your father's involvement?
Oh, my dad, of course, was a teacher, and he had a very serious automobile accident, so was not taken into the war. He also had 4 children that wouldn't have stopped them. And afterwards, he was influential in the veterans training when the veterans were coming back and getting them back into jobs and accepted into our life again. So, and I remember a lot of that because there was a lot of trauma, and that was the Second World War. That they even came back with pretty traumatized.
Well, obviously
So,
that was a very influential time for that generation growing up, and a different set of values. How would you characterize your parents' values and how they prepared you for life, Betty Ann?
well, my parents were very strict, strict in a good way. You know, they insisted that we were educated and that we understood where our place was in the world. That we didn't, we were encouraged to work hard. Work ethic, I think, for many young people in those days was a big thing. You know, you work to the very best that you could possibly do. So that's sort of the environment I had. I, look back at my parents, and I hope that as a parent that I did a job as good as they did.
Now, you mentioned your education came at a time when, there was an attitude change amongst higher education. You went to high school, Ridley Park High School, and then went on to pre-vet school at the University of Pennsylvania. Tell us about that period in your life and what your involvement was with horses at that time.
Well, at that time, it was I had been doing a lot of teaching and training. And my parents, because my father was a school teacher, and school teachers at that time were not highly paid, and my brother being in medical school, it was taking a lot of money, so I had to earn my money to get on into school. And so that's one of the reasons I didn't finish, because there was no money. But instead, I continued, writing and training, teaching, and I made a little bit of money with horses just because I would take young horses and bring them along and sell them. And I did a lot of taking horses into the hunting field, and they did really well in the hunting field. And, of course, people were always very anxious to buy a nice hunting horse.
Well, where did you do this, Betty Ann? Did you do it at the family property, or did you have to go to a riding school for this?
No, I never went to a riding school. My Uncle Peter had a horse farm, and I spent a lot of my time there. But I hunted with the Rose Tree Hunt Club, the Radnor Hunt Club, which was right in my area from the time I was little. I fox hunted with down at William DuPont's at Fair Hill, and actually hunted with Ross Taylor. He had hounds then, and I rode the whip. And I did a lot of showing over fences. I showed dressage is my big thing now, but it came out of my training hunters and jumpers. Back in the 1950s, I guess I don't even remember the exact time. Maybe it was in 40s, I forget. The American Horse Shows Association had us begin to ride against the clock, particularly for open jumping. And I found that very difficult on my horses. And that I could get over the fences, but I was many times under the clock. So that at that time, and this was sort of the opening time in my life, that I had this wonderful man come that didn't speak very good English at all, and he saw me ride and encouraged me, and he said, Betty, I come, I help. And I didn't know exactly what he meant, but he began to come several days a week and began to school me. And that was the first time I ever heard the terms half halt and volte, and I learned how to ride the horse from behind. That man's name was Paul Keck. That was his Americanized name, but he was actually the best friend from Berlin to Nemeth. They were on the team together at the Royal Hungarian Academy in Budapest. And, of course, that was the training that was so important for us here in the United States. And, of course, Bill Steinkraus will know it only too well, how that training from Berlin to Nemeth created our team in the United States to become one of the greatest in the world. So, and that inspired me. That dressage, then I began to understand the importance of dressage and knew that that was where I really wanted to go. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to know more about the development of the horse and the right way and training. So that's sort of, this was my high point in my life when Paul Keck came into my life.
So going back to those days when you did some hunting as a small child, and then you made the progression into hunters and jumpers, was that a natural progression then, Betty Ann, or was it just that was available at that time for you to get into?
Oh, no, I continued both at the same time. I mean, all winter we'd fox hunt. We'd fox hunt all winter, and then in the spring we'd go to the shows and compete and right up until fall. And actually in the summertime we'd take the hounds out and cubbing, and so the horse shows and the fox hunting tied in hand in glove.
Yes, but I'm just wondering why you chose hunters and jumpers as a young person.
It was the thing at that day,
right.
In those days. In the United States, that was sort of on the East Coast. If you were in the West, you'd probably done Western riding, but on the East Coast, that was the big thing that we did, hunters and jumpers, equitation classes. There were other fields, too, like the American Saddlebred and so forth. I was not involved with that, but that was what we did in those days. We did not have eventing in our country at that time. We had hunter trials and the hunt races, which I participated in, but then you see the dressage came and the eventing. But that was not until right after the Second World War, and I guess at 1948 might have been a pivotal time, that we here in the United States began to appreciate that we needed to compete internationally. And at that time, we then brought in the beginnings of understanding dressage, doing the eventing. And it wasn't until 1952 that we represented, and without being in the military, because previous to that it was always the military that was in international competition. Then we phased out through General Henry to the civilians, and of course that's when Bill Steinkraus and Hugh Wiley and when they all became very well known. And then at that time, they did begin to allow women to compete against men. Before that, women could not compete internationally against men. So in 1952, Marjorie Haynes, who then became Marjorie Gill, and many people know her husband, Harry Gill, and Idle Dice, and who were great jumpers. But Marjorie Gill was about 21 and 22 years old. And she was trained under Fritz Stecken on a horse that was a prize of war from the Second World War. And that horse's name was Flying Dutchman. And Marjorie went to Helsinki, Finland, to compete in the Olympic competition. She did go previously to that to many international shows in Europe, so that with our team it was extremely difficult for her. Actually, I have, and I can say it now, but there was a time when I wouldn't have, I have a complete chronicle of everything that happened to her at that time, to make it very, very difficult for an American woman in international competition. But that's another story. Then in 1952, Marjorie went to the Olympic Games under Fritz Stecken, and at the same time, Gunnar Anderson, who was a great friend of Fritz Stecken's, they had always competed together, trained Liz Hartel on a mare called Jubileum. Nobody knew that until the Olympics came out, that pairing with Liz Hartel and Jubileum. The interesting thing is Liz Hartel won the silver medal, and the important thing to remember is that she was a woman and that she had had polio and was partially handicapped from polio. So, these are all things that were part of my life because they were inspirations to me. And so I sort of bring that up in my talk because they are an important part of, what it was to be in dressage in the United States at that time.
Of course, very, very influential. And I'm curious, before you got working with these people and were rubbing shoulders with the Bert Denemethys and the Bill Steinkrauses and so on, when you were looking at the sport as an outsider and as a young girl, who would have been the people that inspired you then that were actively competitive at that time?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, goodness sakes alive. There were quite a few they were mostly more local. There was Ike Grice, there was Frankie Glover. Those names wouldn't mean a thing to you, but they were, at that time, real, competitors. In the shows, let's say there was Colonel Kitts, who was the father of the current Colonel Kitts. A lot of different horsemen in the area. Oh goodness, there was an Irishman that I worked with, Dick Atkinson. Dick Atkinson, the old senior, not the Dick Atkinson that would have been the senior now, way back. I mean, he was a fantastic horseman. Trained his son to go to Dublin in the open jumpers and the big competition, I guess the Grand National of Ireland. But they were the ones that were my inspiration and also my teachers. They did teach me. I went and they were not easy on me. I mean, I had to ride horses that sometimes, if my parents had been out there where I was, they might have had a fit. But they were tough trainers. They were tough teachers. They were real horsemen. And they'd put you up on a horse and say, you sit there and keep your feet tight, keep your heels down, and don't cry. No crying and riding. I'm serious. I had old Dick Atkinson tie my toes together in front one time because around the front because he said I stuck my toes out too much, and it was all right until the mare came down over a fence and fell. and I got beat up a bit too. But and they inspired me. They inspired me to know that training horses must be done with understanding and love and never with force, and teaching, you never raise your voice. The student doesn't come out there to be yelled at. The military technique of training is wrong. So, yes, I guess you can say I got my inspiration from some tough old horsemen.
Now, tell us about the competitions, the horse shows that you rode in, that you maybe had some favorite venues, did you, at the time, that you enjoyed showing at?
Oh, it was sort of fun. Harrisburg Horse Show was always fun. Good competitors came in. Devon Horse Show was not like it is today. It was a fun show. We showed at Devon. I didn't travel abroad as much when I was younger. I had to stay more in this area because we didn't, my parents weren't ready to cart me off across the country to be on a horse. So, but then as I grew older, and I was in on the early, I know that you know dressage at Devon now, but I was in on the very beginning of dressage at Devon and was one of the founding people for the Delaware Valley Combined Training Association, that is really a big organization now in this country, and was the starting of dressage at Devon, and the other events that we had that now are like at Fair Hill and all of those were originally founded by the work that we did with the Delaware Valley Combined Training Association.
And you also did some competing in hunter trials too, didn't you?
Oh, yes, I did hunter trials, and that was a lot of fun.
And taught you to, with your hunting background and then going hunter trials as well. And did that lead you to having a go at eventing?
Well, yes, it did, because it went right into eventing. That because then you see, the competing became a little bit more specialized. Then you needed to begin to understand what dressage was about. And that was my strong point because dressage became my real love at that time. And I love the galloping over fences. The other thing, too, I have to say that at this time I was married and had my first child when I was doing the eventing. And I backed off quite a bit from the eventing. It didn't challenge me either. I mean, first of all, I couldn't take a chance on getting hurt, and some of the horses that I ended up riding were tough horses, and because I didn't have the money to go out and buy horses that had been trained by anybody else or that were really top drawer horses. I had some good horses, then, and I was very, very fortunate. I was very fortunate to have the trainers and the horses that I had, but it was just through good fortune that happened to me. And then, of course, with the eventing, I began to phase out of eventing. I continued fox hunting for quite a few years, but then came the dressage. I worked with Bent Lundqvist from Sweden, and I went to Europe in 1974 with our World Championship team, not to compete, but I went with them, and then to have lessons there with some of the dressage masters in Germany.
Well, you mentioned that you got married. You married in 1955 to your current husband, Donald Lester. Yes. Tell us how you two met. Do you remember how he proposed? Tell us the story.
How did I meet him? Well, we have a picture here of us sitting together on the steps at my parents' house. I think I was 5 and he was 6. We grew up together, and his parents and my parents were very close. And I don't know, he went into the service. It just seemed he was sort of like a brother in a way, but it just one thing led to another. So I guess there was never anybody else. As far as proposing to me, yeah, he was in the submarine Navy, and I think that he wrote a letter one night when he was deep down under the Mediterranean Ocean, and that was, that was the beginning of it.
Was that the proposal that came via airmail?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, he first sent it to my parents. I didn't even know he was doing it, and they raised Cain about that. Because they didn't know. I didn't even know he was going to propose to me. It was funny,
So how long did you have to wait from the time that you saw him again and accepted and then got married? Tell us that story.
Well, oh, goodness, he didn't come home till that following spring. And then he wanted me to get married while he was still in the service, and I said, absolutely not. He was stationed at Key West, Florida, and I said, do you know how much hay costs in Florida? No way. I'm not leaving my horse. So it was 2 years. By the way, he married me for better and for horse.
And where did you spend your honeymoon?
Up in the Poconos.
Right. And then you had a family, as you say, you were already competing when you had Patricia, and you had altogether 4 children.
Yes,
now.
I had Patricia, and then I had Marianne, and then I had Donnie. They were each about 18 months apart, and then 4 years later I had Wayne.
Now, have they inherited any of the horse genes?
My daughters both rode with me. My son Donnie was my right arm. He was with me in the barn, and unfortunately, well, that's a little part of my unhappy history. And I was competing and had been competing internationally. Well, in this country, I'd been competing in some pretty big competition, had some nice horses, but my son was killed, and that put a kibosh on it all. I sort of quit at that time. He was killed on our farm.
Right.
So but he was a great help for me. He'd go to the horse shows with me. He rode, and it wasn't his love to become a great rider, but he was very much interested in the horses. So, and both of my daughters rode with me, and they grew up, they went away to college, and both of them have very good careers now.
Now, you were focusing on dressage at this time then, Betty Ann, and you'd obviously...
Definitely, yep.
Did you give up jumping altogether to focus exclusively?
We jumped our horses a little bit because that's all part of what they need to do. Horses need to be taken out and ridden up and down hills cross country and jumped over fences, but not as a discipline, only to continue the development of their body. Fritz and Bent Lundquist and the trainers and Paul Keck were always extremely influential with me and insisted that I learn anatomy and physiology. And, of course, then I went to the University of Pennsylvania Large Animal Hospital and took many of the courses there so that I had a complete understanding of anatomy and physiology. I did all the lameness courses. I did all of the radiation courses and everything not because I needed a degree, but because I needed to know. I understand the horse's body. You don't train something if you don't understand it inside and out.
Right.
So that's what I was concentrating on at that time and spending many, many hours, really becoming completely educated, not just from one leg on each side on a horse, but I believe one of the big things that I believe in is knowledge and understanding, and only through the understanding of the classical art of dressage that we have been fortunate to have from the great masters. That only through that can we become great horsemen. And that's if, right now, if I give a lecture and if you read my autobiography, you'll find that was my emphasis always on understanding the four greatest classical masters in the world. And since those four, no others have existed because there's nothing new. The horse still only has four legs, a head, and a tail, and his body is exactly the same that it was 350 years ago under Zonathan. So that's sort of my, I get off on a kick sometime, and that's what it is.
Well, looking at your career and that you've participated in so many different disciplines, Betty Ann, was there anything or is there anything that intimidates you as a rider?
People. People. Yes. People. Sometimes I get backed off from the, people that overextend a horse or don't understand them, and I get intimidated a little bit. But as far as if you're saying, have I ever been afraid or anything like that in the training? Not really. I mean, a horse is a horse, and like 2 days ago, my horse rolled over on top of me, but that was okay. He got up and I got up and we're fine. And no, I'm not intimidated by anything except the politics of the horse show ring, particularly, what I see now in the dressage arena and what is happening in our country backs me off and intimidates me to put my head under the covers and stay out of it.
And what has helped you to overcome adversity, both in the sport and in life, Betty Ann?
To overcome adversity?
Mm-hmm.
There's only one way you overcome adversity, whether it's with horses or anything else. You keep two legs down underneath of you and your head in the middle.
Right.
Because otherwise, every one of us run into adversity, and you find out the answers, and if you can change something, you go ahead and change it, and if you can't change it, well then just keep on going.
Now you have a warm blood, and you're still involved actively riding, and are you competing at all these days, Betty Ann?
I'm not competing, but I've said to some of my students that I would like for maybe one of them to take. I have this wonderful Danish warm blood. He's a Donner Hall. He's by a horse from Denmark called Donner Hall, actually the grandson of Donner Hall. Beautiful horse, a very fine mover, very talented horse. And I'm enjoying him every single day because it's just like he's just very, very keen, good mover. And I find it at 78 difficult to ride the way that I used to, but I do. And when I have him finish train, but I will not really compete him unless he's going fourth level and up, because otherwise, the shows aren't set up to give a good foundation for a dressage horse. And that's another subject. But no, this is a very fine horse. I hope I live long enough to bring him to Grand Prix.
And as you say, he's a Danish warm blood, but you did have some experience with saddlebreds, didn't you? And that.
Oh my goodness, yes. My first horse was that I had trained to Grand Prix was an American saddlebred. His name was Determination. I had some wonderful pictures of him. And the thing that happened, you see, is that my Irish-bred horses and my warm bloods, when Fritz Stecken came to live with us in the 60s, the first thing that he did is he looked at my horse and he says, "No, these are not horses for an American lady." He said, I don't want, and I had a wonderful horse that was by Philip Hoffman's stallion, Hercules, and Fritz wouldn't let me compete on him, but I did take him and I won the dressage for the Pan Am tryouts and up in New Jersey on this horse, but he had me sell him because he was a warm blood. And that was when he insisted that I would get thoroughbreds and American saddlebreds, and that's how I ended up with my first saddlebred. I would never have bought one because I didn't know that much about them. But since then, I have found they're fantastic horses, and they are American. And, of course, that's the one thing Fritz said. Americans should show on American horses and not on European horses. Besides that, he said, we Germans aren't stupid. He says, we're not sending our good horses to you Americans. So he says, you get our grade B horses and then come back to Germany to compete. So I don't know if you know anything about Fritz Stecken, but I know many of the old horse people out there, they knew who I'm talking about when I talk about Fritz Stecken and Richard Veitchen. And Albert Stecken was the director of the West German Olympic Committee for many years.
So when you look back on your career with horses, Betty Ann, what accomplishments would you be most proud of?
Oh, goodness. My students and seeing them continue and that they maintained, the whole understanding that lightness and flexibility and self-carriage was the key. And when I see my students out there competing now and winning, and I'm so pleased and proud of them. I have a young girl right now, in fact, 13 years old, and I took her to the stallion tryouts last fall down at Hilltop, which is a big breeding farm here of warm bloods, and she went for the confirmation trials. And when I watch that young girl ride and I work with her, it just gives me a thrill. So that's the big thing right now is seeing young people and their enthusiasm.
And what would have been your most memorable moments with horses? Would it be in competition or the horses that you've reared at home?
Yeah, my most memorable, I think, was probably when I competed against Karl Mokolka, who was from Austria. And he and I ended up with scores so much higher than anyone else's, and I whooped him. And I came out of the ring that day really proud. That was the time when I was really training very hard, and that was a special time. It was, he was a fine rider. He was a really good rider, so And my horse that day, he was like he was flying above the ground. He was so good. It was a great test.
Well, we know that you're an accomplished pianist and organist. Do you still play, Betty Ann? Is it still something you enjoy to do?
Oh yes. I actually I have a German organ too. Yeah, I have a Wurzi organ, and I do play the organ, and I've even done a couple of concerts, and up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for the Dutchland Festival, and that's been fun. But that's secondary, It's just the music. The music and the horses just go together.
And how about books and literature and art? Have they played a part in your life?
Oh, yes. Oh, very much so.
Are you
yes.
Are you a keen reader?
I am. I read all the time as much as I possibly can.
Now, would they be horse books or other books?
I read a lot of horse books. I read let's see. I do actually have a funny one right here now, and right alongside of me. That most of the books that I read are a little bit more technical, but this one is Horses Never Lie About Love, and it's by Jana Harris, and that's right at my fingertips. I read all the time. I read about many things, not just horses.
And so at the end of the day, Betty Ann, when you close your door, what has meant the most to you, and how would you like to be remembered as a horsewoman?
I guess that what I would like to be remembered is that I help to make the lives of horses and people better, and give people, the understanding of what a wonderful gift we have been given in a horse, and how it enhances our lives, and and anything that I can do to make the life of these young people coming up and have them understand how important it is to really understand the horse. I know that I wish that every horseman in the United States would get a hold of that book by Dr. Gerd Hirschman from Germany, and it's called Tug of War, but I wish that everybody in the United States or in the world that proposes to be a horseman, that they would understand what he's trying to tell us.
And so what would your message be to young people then that want to make a profession with horses?
I would tell them to study the horse in every aspect, to understanding physically and psychologically in every respect, and to spend hours and hours of time and know that you will never, ever completely know it.
Well, Betty Ann, I know that you've been an inspiration to so many people, and I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your memories.
Well, it was fun for me because I've thought of things that I haven't thought of for years. So you've sort of stimulated my memory to remember. Thanks a lot for having me.
I hope you'll join me again next time when we visit the life of another equestrian legend.